All right, well, y'all are the brave ones if you've seen tonight's topic and you have stuck around. You haven't run back out this evening. Hopefully we will have a good lesson on that in just a moment. I appreciate the invitation to be here this evening. I appreciate this congregation over here, and I appreciate the opportunity to get to know some of you. I know I've been over here a couple of times, and I've gotten to know Chris and Devin and David a little bit over the last couple of years, and I treasure those friendships. I highly recommend their podcast. I'm an avid listener of that, and I've really enjoyed that. They even let me come and be a guest on their 1 week whenever they were talking about masculinity. And then this is one of the topics that actually came up that we talked about, because self-control was one of those topics that you don't think is necessarily associated with masculinity, but it was one of the characteristics that was expected of men, at least of a higher order of what it meant to be a man in the ancient world. And Christianity is no different than that. It does not apply it just to men. It applies it to men and to women, but there definitely are some unique ways that Christianity applies that. And I'm sure no one of you here, the good folks at Westgate, would ever struggle with self-control or with discipline or with restraint or with temperance or with any of those terms that we may use. In fact, let's see if any of you struggle with some of these right here. You think you have self-control until they bring the chips and salsa, and then you realize that you do not. Some of you may have just had supper this evening. You may be full of chips and salsa right now. I don't know. They are free. There you go. You got to make the most of it. Sometimes the amount of self-control it takes not to say what's on my mind is so immense, I need to take a nap afterwards. It wears you out to show that much restraint. How about this one? The hardest job ever, working in a bubble wrap factory. Imagine the self-control that is needed for that. I'm right there. I would be popping bubbles all the time. How about this one? Sometimes you end up wearing the evidence that you have no self-control. Sometimes it's pretty evident to everyone else that there is no self-control there, and I'm sure that's what Al Pacino was actually had on his face, was the powdered sugar from donuts. We won't say that there's anything else going on there. And I like this one here. Some of us love books. I was just showing my girls your wonderful library here, which I absolutely love. And here's this person, I've just got to buy this. And the book, of course, is How to Stop Needless Buying. And so we run into that. And then finally, I like this one. Self-discipline is tough because because I'm the boss, and that guy runs a real loose ship. So instead of the tight ship, sometimes we know ourselves well, and we know what our struggles are. Self-control, temperance, restraint, discipline. There's a lot of overlap in those terms. Those terms are synonyms in the English language. And in the Greek language, there are corresponding terms to most of those, or at least there's a whole family of words that have some overlap in the Greek language of the New Testament as well. And I'm not going to get into all those words of the Greek language this evening, but as I said earlier, Christians are not the only ones who are using those words. There were others in the ancient world who were using those words, but there are definitely some unique ways that Christianity not only talks about what is ideal about self-control, but also about a pathway, a realistic pathway of exercising self-control. And there are some major differences between what Christianity teaches with that and what other worldviews of the past and those of the present would teach about that. So I'm tasked with talking about self-control, and we are also talking about gluttony tonight as something, and gluttony is not the only vice that is in opposition to self-control. I think this whole summer, it sounds like y'all are looking at some of these deadly sins, these vices that are opposed to virtue. And really, just about all of these there's a lot of overlap between a lot of these sins, and self-control is definitely relevant to talking about a virtue that is in response to pretty much any of these vices. I mean, if you think about pride is a gluttony of the ego. If you think about lust is a gluttony of the sexual appetite. There's a lot of overlap with these. I think you're going to talk about anger later on. Anger is definitely something that requires some restraint, some self-control when it comes to healthy expressions of anger. So I don't want to step on too many of the other lessons this summer, but there is some overlap here. So yes, we're going to talk about food this evening. Yes, we're going to apply this to our dietary choices, but we're also going to apply it to some other issues as well. Some of the same principles hold true across the board, and a lot of the same things are at the root of some of those other problems that are at the same root cause of gluttony. And whether that's greed or whether that's lust or whether that's pride or anger or whatever else, self-control is something that's going to be involved as part of the formula, as part of the method for changing those behaviors. Self-control is the opposite to many of those things. Tonight, what I want us to mainly focus on are two main enemies of self-control and the potential components of gluttony that we're going to look at tonight that are not just related to food, but are related to a lot of different things. And we're going to talk about why these are struggles for us. And then we're going to get into how we learn to practice self-control as Christians. What is unique about Christianity when it comes to self-control, and maybe some practical ways of developing deeper restraint, deeper self-control. The two main enemies of self-control that we're going to talk about this evening, indulging impulse and indulging excess. So impulse and excess are two forms of gluttony that we're going to talk about, two things that will take us away from self-control if we indulge them. So let's get right into that this evening. We talk about impulse here, and acting on impulse is nothing new in our world today. It's something that we have many examples of in the scriptures. In fact, you go to the first sins that are happening in Genesis chapter 3, and probably every one of these lessons this week in some way could go back to Genesis chapter 3. And of course, there's the tree that Eve's not supposed to take from. And look at what it goes on here. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, so there's your food component of this. And you can see that's connected with a desire of her eyes. So there is a lust of the eyes that is here, to use a term that is going to be picked up in the New Testament later on in 1 John, talking about some of the things that are at the root of what we deal with in the world, what the world throws at us, the lust of the eyes. She sees that the tree was good for food. So her eyes are telling her, are sending her this sensory information that this fruit, even though God has said it is not good and that there are alternatives, but her eyes are sending her the sensory information that this is good. And this is, so she's hearing this voice in a sense. Yeah, we know she's heard the voice of the serpent, but she's hearing this voice. Her own eyes are going along with what the serpent is telling her. And so they are playing a role in this. So it's good for food. Here's another component. It was delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, so it appeals to her ego as well. She took from its fruit and ate, and she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. And so the first sin of Scripture involves eating. So that maybe I should tell us something. It's something we don't want to talk about much, how eating can be. Let me say this straight up. I love to eat. I love good food. Please don't think I'm coming in here tonight and trying to ruin all your fun about eating food. There's a lot in the Bible about feasting. There's a lot about food being a delight to us. So we are not condemning all forms of eating this evening, and I hope that's obvious. But this is certainly one of those areas where you have Eve who is acting on her impulses here. Now, there are other examples, not just Eve. You go later in the book of Genesis, you're going to see Esau, the brother of Jacob. And Esau, this is again one that's food related. Esau comes in and he is hungry, but instead of being patient and waiting for something, he sees with his eyes. He sees what Jacob is making. There's probably a lot of other sensory information there. We know he saw it because he just calls it red stuff. He doesn't even care what it is at this point. He just says, give me some of that red stuff over there that you're making. But obviously he would have smelled this. He's ready to taste it. He can start imagining it from his previous experience, what that would taste like. And he says, as we often do in moments whenever we act on impulse, he convinces himself that I need this, and I need this right now, and I need it, whatever it takes to get it. He says, I am starving. Now, he's not literally starving. I'm sure he's very hungry. But he is not going to kill over and die within the next few moments if he does not have some of that red stuff over there, which is a lentil stew that Jacob is making. And I've had lentil stew before. It's fine. But it's certainly not something I'm going to sell something for. But you don't think straight when you become desperate. And so you see Esau trading his own birthright for access to have just some of this stew that his brother is making. So you see Esau acting on impulse. You see other people. One of the most impulsive people in Scripture is Samson. And though we don't read too much about food-wise, we do have the one story about him finding honey in a dead animal in the belly of a lion, and he still can't resist getting a taste of that. So maybe his belly, longing for food, was part of his struggles too. But you see Samson, who once said not even just about his food appetites, but even his sexual appetites got him in trouble a lot of times. He once told his parents, after seeing a Philistine woman, go get her for me. She looks good to me. That's all he knew about her. She looks good to me, so go get her for me. And so acting on impulse. Many examples in his life of acting on impulse. How about Peter? Peter is someone, who lacked restraint in what he said and sometimes in what he did. Peter who said, Lord, it's good for us to be here. Let's make 3 tabernacles, 3 homes of worship, 3 places where heaven and earth are supposed to meet. But let's make one that's dedicated to you and one to Elijah and one to Moses, putting them all on the same par. He meant well. But he just spoke what had entered into his mind without even thinking through what he was really saying there. Impulsive speech. And of course, he had to be rebuked on that occasion. Or the time whenever he said, Lord, never will you wash my feet, when Jesus was going to wash his disciples' feet. And Peter's impulse was to say, no, that's not right. You can't do that. And so he just speaks whatever's on his mind. Or maybe Peter will say something like, Lord, I'll never deny you. And then it's just a few hours after that that Jesus basically says, I've got a rooster who says otherwise. This is the same Peter who, in impulsive anger, before that moment comes, ends up taking out a sword and cutting off the ear of a fellow human being. So impulsive action is there in Scriptures too. And then this is these are just some of the examples that I think of. Now, impulsiveness can be related to this idea of instantaneous or immediate gratification. And this is very difficult in our world that has become increasingly on demand. And we mean that not only in terms of food, but in terms of digital access to just about whatever you want, information, movies, music, just about anything you want. You can pull it up. Most of you have a device with you in here this evening where you could pull those things up right now if you wanted to. And I'm not saying that's all bad, but we are trained to be able to get what we want immediately. Some of you may have heard of the series of experiments that were done in the 1970s at Stanford University, and they're called the Stanford Marshmallow Experiments. So the Stanford Marshmallow Experiments, basically they put kids of different ages in a room by themselves, and they told them, okay, here's one marshmallow that you can have right now if you want to eat it right now. Or you can wait, not touch the marshmallow, and if you can wait, and I believe the study was maybe 15 minutes, if you can wait 15 minutes, then we will bring you 2 marshmallows that you can have, but you have to wait. If you touch the marshmallow or eat the marshmallow now, then you forfeit your right to having double that later on, the 2 marshmallows. This was a test to see how quickly we go for what's right in front of us, even if there's the promise of something greater later on if we will just wait, if we don't indulge the impulses and the immediacy of what's right in front of us. Now, what they found was interesting. Some of these kids were able to wait. They were able to think about a greater reward later. Many of them were not, though. They saw this as more advantageous to go ahead and indulge what's right in front of them rather than wait for more later on. It shows that even from a young age, we struggle with this idea of self-control. Even if there is a promise of something greater or something better, if we will wait, showing the restraint for that is a very difficult human discipline. And so that's always been a fascinating study. As part of this gratification, we mentioned the senses earlier. The Bible has a word that's going to be translated many times as sensuality in our English translations. And sometimes that has a sexual connotation, but not always. And these are just some of those passages where this is going to be used. We won't look at all those scriptures this evening, but those are some of the places where you're going to see that word or some other equivalent that comes up. And if you have a different translation, if it doesn't use that one, some of the older translations are going to use the word licentiousness. And you can kind of see the word license in that word, licentiousness. That's not a Greek word. That actually comes from the same Latin root as the word license. And that's really the idea of feeling entitled that what you are sensing, that sensory data of what you're being fed, our senses, what we see, what we hear, what we smell, what we taste, or sometimes we can imagine tasting because we smell it, and then because we see it, and because we've had past experience with it, and the things that we touch, all those things can draw us towards things. So really, our senses play an important role as people of God. We're made in God's image. He gave us senses for a reason. But when senses get control of you, and you are led around by your senses, and you feel entitled to sense and to feel and to act upon what is there, immediate gratification, that is part of that, these passions that come along with that. If you do that without patience, without moderation, without proper boundaries, then you may think that you have license to do this, which we think of associating with freedom, but in fact, we're really a type of slave whenever we are led by our senses, and whenever we just indulge those senses that we have. I love what Edmund Burke, who was a political and just a good thinker from the 1700s, what he said here. He said that men are qualified for civil liberty in exact proportion to their disposition to put moral chains upon their own appetites. Society cannot exist unless a controlling power upon will and appetite be placed somewhere. And the less of it there is within, the more there must be without. It is ordained in the eternal constitution of things that men of intemperate minds cannot be free. Their passions forge their fetters. It's another word for your chains. You're being chained. Now allow me to paraphrase this, since I know we don't speak with all the words that Mr. Burke uses in our common language today. You cannot handle the idea of liberty if you lack restraint of your passions, your desires, your impulses. There must be boundaries, and the less self-restraint, self-discipline, self-control that you are able to show, the more the necessity for outside controls. And we complain about outside controls. It's kind of built into our fabric of our country to seek freedom. But what people have done is they've taken freedom and they've turned it into just license to do whatever I want to do without any restraint, without the control. And we think that's somehow virtuous. And that's not what biblical freedom is. Not at all. The Bible calls that slavery. Your passions end up forging your fetters. They put you in chains. You're a slave to them. And that's certainly true. It can be true when it comes to food. It can be true when it comes to sex. It can be true when it comes to money or to power or to anger or to just about anything else. You turn into a slave. In fact, this is what some of those scriptures that are going to talk about being slaves to impulse. Proverbs 25:28, like a city whose walls are broken down is a man who lacks self-control. That's it. You have the boundaries, the guarding of yourself. The Proverbs are also going to talk about guarding your heart. Well, you have let the guard down. You've let the walls collapse when we lack that self-control. John 8:34, this is what Jesus tells us. You cannot admit that you are a sinner and not also admit that you're a slave. Okay? Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who commits sin is the slave of sin. All sin has an addictive nature to it. It will turn us into slaves. And here's another one, 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 18 and 19, for speaking out arrogant words of vanity. These are people who have become Christians, but then they are going back. They are arrogantly going back to the ways of the world in their actions. They enticed by fleshly desires, by sensuality. There's our word. They're being led by their senses. They're just being controlled by what they want to touch and what they want to hear and to see and to everything else in the moment. Those who barely escape from the ones who live in error, promising them freedom. They say, come on. Isn't that what the serpent basically said to Eve in the beginning? Has God really said this? God's just trying to keep you from the good life. He's just trying to restrict your license. He's restricting your freedom, promising them freedom while they themselves are slaves of corruption. For by what a man is overcome, by this he is enslaved. So that slavery language goes along with this impulsive, indulging impulsive behavior all through the scriptures. So that's a little bit about living by impulses and why that is not good. God made us good, but we've got to realize that though there are real desires and we are not against all desire, there is healthy desire. And we'll talk about that more in just a moment. But we need to realize that in a broken world in which I am part of that broken world, my desires in some ways have been corrupted. Okay, they've been twisted. And it may be twisted to seek out things that I shouldn't have to begin with. Maybe it is or it's seeking out excessive measures of what may be a good thing in smaller amounts, but not in excessive amounts. And that is certainly true of a lot of this. And we'll talk more about excess as we go along. I want to get to this idea here. Let's talk a little bit more about the appetites, the desires. And this is where we get not just into just talking about impulses in general, but let's talk more about desire. The Bible is not totally anti-desire. There was a group who was anti-desire pretty much across the board in the time the New Testament was written. They are actually mentioned in the New Testament. In Acts 17, when Paul goes to the city of Athens and he encounters some of these people. They're called the Stoics. And the Stoics, they were known for their apathy. And apathy is not literally, the original meaning of this is not really just, hey, I don't care about anything. No, it really means that pathos is the idea of passion. So to be apathetic is to cease the passions, is to cease the desires. And some people look at all the wrong that can come with desire for food or for sex or for other things, and they think, okay, well, the only solution is just to stop all desire and just live lives where there is no desire. We've got to cease all that desire. The Stoics believed in that. In our world today, if you study Buddhism teaches this. Buddhism thinks that you wouldn't be suffering if you didn't have these desires. If you didn't desire something that tasted good, then you wouldn't be suffering whenever you're just eating the leftovers for the third straight day. That wouldn't bother you if you didn't have a desire for better food. It wouldn't bother you that you deal with this pain if you didn't have a desire not to have the pain. Buddhism says you got to cease from all desire if you're going to cease from suffering. That's not what Christianity teaches either. There is real pain, there is real suffering, and there's a place for desire. Christians have a more nuanced view of this. And here it is. We're not apathetic. We believe in passion. We believe in desire. We believe that appetites are not inherently evil, but they are dangerous. And we do need to say that. They are dangerous. To some degree, they are good and they are necessary. So here, they have to be kept within boundaries. I've got a spectrum up here tonight, and I want to put some terms up here. And I want you to think about this spectrum. This is between these two areas, and this is you can use the spectrum for a lot of different desires, but let's take our appetite for eating. Let's take our appetite for eating. The Bible talks about fasting. The Bible, and we'll come back to that a little bit more later on, but there is a place for fasting. It's not just an Old Testament discipline. You see in the New Testament, you see Jesus talk about whenever you fast. You're going to see that the early church, you have examples like in Acts chapter 13, where the church at Antioch was fasting. Several people were fasting to try to discern the Spirit's will for where their mission work was to go and to who was to be a part of that. Fasting along with prayer. So there is a time for fasting, but there is a time for feasting. The Bible's full of feasting. We're doing, as our theme over at College Avenue this summer, Come to the Feast. And we've talked about the Feast of Tabernacles or Booths, and we've talked about the feast. We're going to talk about the Feast of the Passover, and we're going to talk about some of the Feast of Pentecost and some of these other things where you celebrate the harvest by having a feast and you have food together. And Jesus went and he shared food with people. He ate with them, and that's not a bad thing. A lot of good things happen around a table of food and feasting together, and that's been part of God's plan all along, is to have time of feasting. So what I would say is that there is feasting, there is fasting, and then there's probably more what your normative food experience would be when you're not feasting and when you're not fasting. And I think there's a healthy spectrum between those two that's good. That there's a good variety that is there, that is a healthy spectrum of where those appetites could fall. But we as humans tend to go outside the healthy boundaries. So on one end, going outside the healthy boundary would look like what we would call extreme asceticism. Asceticism is where you are doing things that are harmful, dangerously harmful to your body if they're in the extremes. And then on the other end, you've got indulging these things, or excess is what I should have put up there. Let's talk about extreme asceticism for a moment, because we don't want to fall into that. This is Stoicism. This is Buddhism. This is some of these things. And the book of Colossians is going to address this. In chapter 2, verses 20 and 23, if you have died with Christ to the elemental principles of the world, why, as if you were living in the world, do you submit yourself to decrees, such as do not handle, do not taste, do not touch? That is taking your senses out of the picture completely and saying there's no role to be played for what you see, for what you touch, for what you taste. You know, that you don't need to listen to any of that at all. It says, when you take on decrees like that and you submit to them, it says they all refer to things destined to perish with use, in accordance with the commandments and teachings of men. These are matters which have, to be sure, the appearance of wisdom in self-made religion and self-abasement. That this is, humiliation of yourself, not just humility, but a humiliation, a degradation of yourself, self-abasement, and severe treatment of the body, but are of no value against fleshly indulgence. He's saying you don't want to be a glutton? Good. Saying you don't want to be a greedy person or someone who's just led around by your sexual appetites or led by the impulses of your anger or anything else? Good. But do not go to the other extreme and say that there is no place for people to feast, that there is no place for you to enjoy food, that there's no place to enjoy anything. That's what some of the people seem to be doing and thinking that they're more spiritual by doing this. There's a place for fasting, but fasting is not meant to be abuse or punishment for yourself. It's an avenue of learning self-control. It is not punishment to yourself. That's not how it should be used. I once ran into a teenager who cared very much about his relationship with God, but he was cutting himself. And I know a lot of people struggle with that for different reasons. His reason for cutting himself on his arms and his legs was because he struggled with the sin of pornography, and he felt like every time that he looked at pornography that he had to punish himself by cutting himself afterwards. There are some people who that's a distorted view of what guilt. There is a healthy, godly sorrow, and that leads us to repentance. It is not self-infliction of punishment. Jesus has carried our sins on the cross. There's no more that I can do to atone for my sins by trying to do those things to myself. I don't want to go too far down that road, but I'll just tell you, people can go to the other extremes here whenever they start to abuse themselves in some way. There are forms of fasting where people take them to such extremes. They do hunger strikes, and to the point where they may even be putting their life on the line as part of the process. And that's not what God intended with these things. 1 Timothy chapter 4 also warns of this when it comes to both food and to sex. Spirit explicitly says in later times, some will fall away from the faith, paying attention to deceitful spirits, doctrines of demons, men who forbid marriage, and most likely what they are forbidding is the sexual component of that marriage. People who were saying, you need to stop doing that altogether. There's evidence in 1 Corinthians of the church at Corinth that some people who are married had stopped having sexual relations because they thought it was a moral evil to do so. If you're married, it's not. Okay, it's something that is, it's an important component of marriage. So people who forbid marriage and advocate abstaining from foods, so this is beyond just normal fasting. This is taking away entire food categories or other things that God has not said to do, but saying that you're going to be more spiritual if you just completely deny yourself any of the pleasures of eating or even the pleasures of sex, even within a marriage, that's always wrong. And this passage says God's created these things to be gratefully shared in by those who believe and know the truth. For everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with gratitude. For it is sanctified. It's declared holy by means of the word of God and prayer. These things are not unholy in and of themselves. Sex is not unholy by itself. Food is not unholy by itself. We can go outside the boundaries, and that can be unholy, but that is not what God has intended for us. All right. On the other extreme, though, we do have gluttony. We have the excess. We talked about when you go beyond the fasting and denial. Well, what about when you go beyond the feasting and the indulgence? Well, that's excess. That's gluttony. That's a lot of what we're talking about this evening. Just a few passages where this type of thing is mentioned. Philippians chapter 3, verses 18 and 19 mentions these enemies of the cross of Christ whose God is their, and then your translation will either say their belly or their appetite. How about that language? Whose God is their belly, whose God is their appetite. Again, appetite, not wrong in and of itself. When it becomes your God, it's absolutely wrong. That's idolatry. And this is one of the many forms of idolatry. I started, and I don't say this to brag at all, just an area where I realized I had to change. I have spent much of my life where I felt like my belly or my appetites were gods at times to me. I had to, a couple of years ago, start putting on a little more weight and start to have digestion issues and this type of thing. And I'd been in a pattern most of my life of coming back at 9:30, 10 p.m., 10:30, 11 p.m., whenever, and getting a big snack again. Sometimes, my younger days, sometimes a whole nother meal. You know, Taco Bell didn't invent the expression fourth meal. That was me. That was me going back, getting something else again. And I knew that was not going to be sustainable for me, health-wise, and for my spiritual health either. Too much of my mindset, my life was being driven by, where's my next meal coming from? What am I eating tomorrow? Let me plan out my day according to my meals. What time are we eating? That's always question number one, right? Now, what have we got left in the fridge? Have we stocked up on groceries for this? You know, it's just, you can get to the point where you're controlled by your belly. And I was at that point, and I realized something's got to change. Well, it helped me to embrace intermittent fasting, because over time, the body adjusts to new patterns, and over time, you know what? My body realized it doesn't have to be fed every couple of hours. It doesn't have to have a meal at this exact time, and this exact time, and this exact time, and some rest time for the body of not indulging anything as far as food goes can be a good thing. Okay? So, whose God is their belly? Titus 1 verse 12. One of themselves, a prophet of their own, said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. See that association there, even with an expression. The Bible's actually, this is Paul who is writing to Titus. He's saying, you know, there's some truth in this statement that people have made of the people on the island of Crete, that there's a lot of them that struggle with these things, lying, with beast-like behavior, and with a laziness and gluttony that go together. There is some of that is there. I want to caution us against something before I go any further. Gluttony is not ultimately about just how much you weigh or don't weigh. Okay? Don't think that I'm saying that if you're above the ideal weight that you're a glutton, and that if you're at or below that you're not a glutton. These are different things for different people. There are people who may look like they're in great shape, and they may be in great shape health-wise, and they may still struggle with their appetites controlling them. And there may be some other things going on there under the surface. So please don't think I'm just making a statement about what your appearance is or what your weight is this evening. That's really not the measure of whether or not you are struggling with gluttony or not. There are other things going on here. Proverbs 23, verses 20 and 21. Do not be heavy drinkers of wine, or with gluttonous eaters of meat. So there's another example of things that they're taken to excess. For the heavy drinker and the glutton will come to poverty, and drowsiness will clothe one with rags. I love what, and of course, Jesus, he was accused of these things. He was accused of being a wine bibber. He was accused of being a glutton. You read of that in the New Testament. Because he did participate in feasting. And he saw that as an opportunity to share good, healthy time and to work on calling more disciples and to affirming that he cared about people, to use that time to affirm that he cared about people. And table fellowship is an extremely important idea in the Bible. But, again, you don't want to, you've got to do so with control. You've got to do so with restraint. There's even evidence that in Corinth, there were people who were getting drunk and being gluttons on what should have been the Lord's Supper. There's evidence of that. And so if you don't have that restraint, you're going to take the things that should be a healthy expression of fellowship for Christians or healthy outreach to others, and you're going to twist them into something that has a terrible effect on not only yourself, but on those who witness it. Jesus was falsely accused of these things. I want to read this to you. And I don't know if y'all can read that up there tonight, but I'm going to read it to you. This was John Cassian. He was a 4th century Christian. He wrote these thoughts on gluttony and vices that were related to it. I love this. The soul also has as its foods which are harmful, fattened on which even without superfluity of meats. He wrote this a long time ago. Words we don't throw around a whole lot anymore. It is involved in a downfall of wantonness. Slander is its food, and indeed one that is very dear to it. And he's talking about the soul here. It's talking about what the soul can be prone to. Slander is its food. A burst of anger also is its food, even if it be a very slight one, yet supplying it with miserable food for an hour, and destroying it as well with its deadly savor. There's that sensation language that's coming in there. You've heard of empty calories? Well, there's a lot of things that spiritually we fill ourselves with empty calories. They satisfy us for a very short time, but then they leave us with the Snickers commercials, hangry again. You need something else right away. It doesn't sustain you. Outbursts of anger are like that. Slanders like that. It has a very short-term satisfaction to it. It leaves you hungry afterwards. I love the story in the Chronicles of Narnia. I'm reading these with my oldest girl right now, and in the first book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the White Witch of Narnia, she offers one of the humans, Edmund, she offers him this Turkish delight, which I'm not a huge fan of, but it's a dessert. You can see how some people would be attracted to that. But whenever he takes it, it creates such a sensation that he feels like he has to have more. And the thing is, no matter how much he eats, it never fills him up. He's always hungry. And it's a parable there for what we often end up doing. I didn't mean to stop the quote with that, but I think there's a lot to be thinking about there. A burst of anger is its food, destroying it as well as deadly savor. Envy is a food of the mind, corrupting it with its poisonous juices and never ceasing to make it wretched and miserable at the prosperity and success of another. I think y'all are going to talk about envy if you haven't already in this series. Kenodoxia, which he explains for us, vainglory, this is a false glory, is its food, which gratifies it with a delicious meal for a time, but afterwards strips it clear and bare of all virtue and dismisses it barren and void of all spiritual fruit, so that it makes it not only lose the rewards of huge labors, but also makes it incur heavier punishments. Now listen to this. All lust and shifty wanderings of heart are a sort of food for the soul, nourishing it on harmful meats, but leaving it afterwards without share of the heavenly bread and of really solid food. That's what was going on with the young boy in the Chronicles of Narnia. Taking that Turkish delight, tastes so good, but never really satisfying. Tasty, but not satisfying. And there's so many behaviors that become that for us. And so we indulge them more and more because we think we have to get the same effect. That's how drugs work, right? You get your fix, but then you need more to get your fix the next time. You start to become resistant to the effect of it. And this is how anything can work on us. All right. Let's, with the time that's left here, y'all been very patient with me this evening. Let's talk about learning restraint. Just quickly, some things I want to share with you at the end to carry home with you about this. The Bible has a word that it will often use as, well, these are all passages that are related to this idea. Titus 2 is one of these. Titus 2 verses 11 and 12. For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all men, But here's what else the grace of God does. Not only is our salvation based in it, the grace of God is a tutor. It is designed to teach us, to help us grow, instructing us to deny ungodliness and worldly desires. Again, not denying all desire, but the worldly expressions of those desires, which would be the impulsive expressions of those desires or the excessive expressions of those desires, any expression that goes outside the boundaries that God has set up for those desires, the proper boundaries. That's what we are denying. That's what we are learning to deny, that I do not have to live by those impulses and by those excesses. Instead, I am to live sensibly, righteously, and godly in the present age. Here's another one. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 27. Paul uses the sports metaphor here. If you're an athlete, you understand the importance of self-control. I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way as not beating the air, but I discipline my body and make it my slave. You've heard the joke before. Some of the older translations say, buffet my body, and that is not buffet my body. That is to buffet my body or discipline my body. Notice, make it my slave so that I'm not a slave to it. I make it my slave. Now that's what we want. We will turn the tables on these desires, that we could control them instead of them controlling us. This is what 1 Timothy 4, verse 7 says, discipline yourself for the purpose of godliness. There's that word discipline again. This is an athletic word that is used here. It's where we get our word gymnasium, comes from this word in the Greek. It's a workout, and it is. 2 Timothy 1:7, God has not given us a spirit of timidity, but of power and love and discipline. So all these passages related to discipline in the New Testament, and discipline is so closely tied to self-control. And that's where I'll wrap this up here this evening. And if we are to learn restraint, we have to embrace discipline. God is a disciplinarian in a good way. Discipline is not always punishment. Hebrews chapter 12 talks about how God is a father who out of love disciplines us. And I'm convinced that the primary context of discipline in that passage is not punishment. It is training. It is training you. And you know this if you have kids. I hope that punishment's not the only form of discipline. I hope that there is teaching. I hope that there is training. I hope that there is setting your kids up to succeed, but putting them in situations that will challenge them some so that they can grow. Okay, that's all discipline. It's not just whenever you send them to their room or ground them for 2 weeks or whatever else that you do. So we have to embrace discipline. We have to embrace the spiritual disciplines that we could have a whole series just on these, and maybe I've talked about these here before, but here's just some of those. There's a time for solitude and stillness. There's a time to be quiet, alone, be still and know that I am God. And if we're not willing to embrace that in our hurry world, then we're going to find it very difficult to even begin to practice some of these other disciplines that are here. Sometimes the first part of discipline is to turn off the phone and to get away from even maybe the friends for a little bit, and to turn off the work and other things for the moment. Here's Bible meditation. Bible meditation is not just Bible reading. As important as Bible reading is, and we need to just sometimes read through large chunks of Scripture, Bible meditation is taking just one small section of Scripture, sometimes maybe even just one verse, maybe even just a few words in a verse sometimes. And maybe it's a verse you've been familiar with your whole life. You've already got it memorized. It doesn't have to be something brand new to you. It is taking something, though, and it is reading it slowly, along with a solitude and stillness that's there, and allowing it to go not just to the level of the mind where you accept it intellectually, but to sink to the level of the heart where it becomes part of your will, your intentions. That's true Bible meditation. That's letting God speak to you slowly and carefully through His Word. So that's part of this, of learning restraint. prayer, of course, is a part of this. Prayer is part of this, and here's this one, fasting. Now, fasting is something that I never grew up hearing much about in the church that I grew up in and in the family that I was in. As much as I appreciate that church, as much as I appreciate that family, it's just something that was not talked about as much. Thankfully, I think we are living in a time when there are more Christians who are embracing the importance of fasting, are rediscovering the importance of fasting. If you want to address your appetites when it comes to food, but even when it comes to other things, to what you say, to the lust of your eyes, to how you handle your anger, to all kinds of other things, we've got to learn to embrace fasting again. If you're interested in that and have never tried to practice it, I'm sure Chris or Devin or David can walk you through some advice in that. You can see me or email me. I'm happy to talk with you. Start smaller steps and build your way up is what I suggest. And food, the hunger for food is such a strong drive that if you can learn by God's Spirit, if you can learn to keep that appetite within healthy boundaries and delay that desire for instant gratification and to avoid the excesses and then your desire for that, if you can do that with food, then that same type of discipline is going to start to transfer to other areas of your life too. To how you handle your devices, to how you handle your anger, the words that you say, everything else. Self-control, fasting is one of the most important things that you can do. If there's one last passage I want you to think about this evening and spend some time as homework maybe. Spend some time reading and reflecting in Galatians chapters 5 and 6. Galatians 5 goes through and it talks about the life lived by the Spirit. And it talks about the life lived by the flesh, that's governed by the flesh. And it contrasts those two. Guess where self-control is? It is the fruit of the Spirit. And it is the last one that is mentioned right there. It doesn't mean that, I'm going to put that one off until I get the rest of these down. No, it's not a fruit buffet where you just pick which fruits you want and leave behind the ones you don't. It's a fruit salad. You either get it all or you get none of it. You are learning self-control by practicing the other things that are there because you are embracing the Spirit. This is what spiritual discipline is. It is not you trying to achieve self-control on your own. It is not you trying to out-spiritual someone else. It is you out of gratitude to God, knowing that your body is a temple of the Spirit as a gift to you from God, that you have God living in you and with you. It is doing what the next chapter of Galatians says, sowing to the Spirit. Yes, God's Spirit is there, but you need to sow to that Spirit. Embrace the Spirit of God. Dig in is what sowing really means. You're digging in to what the Spirit has for you. Spiritual disciplines are one of the main ways you're going to do that. You listen to what God has said to you carefully. You let it sink to your heart. You meditate on it. You pray about it. And you learn to fast. And you will go deeper into your relationship with the Spirit. You will learn the self-control that is a fruit of the Spirit. That's my encouragement to you tonight. May you be blessed in what you do. Thank you again for having me this evening.